Sometimes the greatest mercy comes disguised as the cruelest betrayal. The wind howled through the towering pines of the Colorado wilderness, like the voices of the damned, and Keturah Williams knew she was going to die in this godforsaken place. Blood seeped through the rough burlap wrapped around her feet as she stumbled through knee-deep snow 300 miles from the Charleston plantation she'd escaped 6 weeks ago. Behind her lay a trail of broken shackles and dead bounty hunters. Ahead lay only the promise of a frozen grave. But when the bearded mountain man named Jeremiah Stone found her collapsed against his cabin door, delirious with fever and frostbite, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about reckoning with sins that refused to stay buried, even in the deepest wilderness. You see, Jeremiah Stone wasn't the simple fur trapper he appeared to be, and Keturah Williams carried secrets in her blood that would soon call forth spirits hungry for justice. What happens when two people running from their darkest moments find each other in the most isolated place on earth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Keturah felt was warmth, an alien sensation after weeks of bone-deep cold that had settled into her marrow like a living thing. The second was the rough scratch of wool against her skin, and the third was the unmistakable smell of wood smoke mixed with something else, something medicinal and sharp that made her stomach clench with a terror so primal she nearly bolted upright. Easy now. The voice was gravelly, weathered by wind and solitude. "You've been out for 2 days." Keturah's eyes snapped open to find herself staring at exposed wooden beams, blackened by years of hearth smoke. She lay on a narrow cot covered in thick furs, her ruined feet wrapped in clean white bandages. The cabin was small but well-appointed. Shelves lined with books and glass bottles, a stone fireplace crackling with warmth, and hanging from the rafters, an assortment of traps and pelts that spoke of a man who knew how to survive in this wilderness. The mountain man, Jeremiah Stone, sat hunched over a rough-hewn table, grinding something in a wooden mortar with methodical precision. He was bigger than she'd first realized in her delirium, broad-shouldered with hands that moved with surprising delicacy as he worked. His beard was streaked with premature gray, and when he glanced up at her, she caught sight of pale blue eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "Water," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He rose without a word and brought her a tin cup filled with cool, clear water. When she tried to sit up to drink, pain shot through her body like lightning, and she gasped. "Frostbite," he said matter-of-factly. "Lost 2 toes on your left foot. Could have been worse. Another hour, and I'd have been burying you come spring thaw." Keturah drank slowly, studying him over the rim of the cup. There was something unsettling about his calm efficiency, the way he spoke of death and amputation like discussing the weather. But there was also something else, a careful distance in his manner, as if he were examining her the way he might examine a wounded animal he'd found in one of his traps. "Name's Jeremiah Stone," he said, settling back at his table. "And you're a long way from anywhere, girl. 300 miles from the nearest settlement, and winter's got this mountain locked up tight till April." The reality of her situation crashed over her like an avalanche. She was trapped here with this stranger, completely dependent on his mercy. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd escaped one form of captivity only to find herself in another. "I can work," she said quickly. "I can cook, clean, tend wounds. I won't be a burden." Something flickered across his features. Amusement, perhaps, or something darker. "Can you now? And what makes you think I need help with any of those things?" Keturah looked around the cabin again, noting details she'd missed before. Everything was meticulously organized, from the carefully labeled bottles on the shelves to the surgical instruments laid out on a clean cloth beside the mortar and pestle. This wasn't the rough dwelling of an ordinary mountain man. This was the domain of someone with education, someone who understood medicine and chemistry. The realization sent ice through her veins despite the warmth of the fire. "You're a doctor," she breathed. His hands stilled on the pestle. When he looked at her again, those pale eyes had gone completely flat. Was a doctor. Long time ago, in another life. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded secrets. Keturah felt a strange tingling sensation along her arms, as if the very air in the cabin had become charged with electricity. For a moment, she could have sworn she heard something, a sound like children's laughter, distant and hollow, carried on a wind that wasn't there. "Why did you help me?" she asked, pushing down the inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Jeremiah resumed his grinding, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. Man gets lonely up here, makes him do foolish things sometimes. The honesty in his admission was more frightening than any threat could have been. Keturah understood the mathematics of survival, the calculations that desperate people made when civilization's rules no longer applied. She'd escaped one master only to find herself dependent on another, and this one lived beyond the reach of any law save his own. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the cabin's shutters with a sound like skeletal fingers drumming against wood. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the flames. And in that moment, as she lay helpless in a stranger's bed with the Colorado wilderness stretching endlessly in all directions, Keturah Williams felt the first whisper of something that transcended her immediate danger. Something was wrong with this place. Wrong in a way that had nothing to do with isolation or winter or the man who'd saved her life. Something that felt like the prelude to a reckoning she didn't yet understand. The strange sensation lingered in the air long after the wind died down, leaving Keturah staring at the cabin's rafters while her heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on the mundane details of her surroundings rather than the inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with winter's bite. The children's laughter, if it had been laughter at all, was gone now, leaving only the steady scrape of Jeremiah's pestle against stone and the occasional pop and hiss of the fire. Over the following days, she began to understand the rhythm of life in this remote sanctuary that felt increasingly like a prison. Jeremiah rose before dawn each morning, checking his traps and hunting lines with methodical precision. He moved through his routines with the efficiency of a man who had learned to depend solely on himself, every action serving a purpose in the delicate balance of survival. Keturah watched from her cot as he prepared his meals, simple fare of venison, preserved vegetables and hardtack, noting how he always made portions for two, setting her share within reach without comment or ceremony. There was something almost ritualistic about his care, as if he were following rules of hospitality that existed only in his own mind. "You don't have to wait on me," she said one morning when he brought her a steaming bowl of stew. "I can manage." Jeremiah paused, his pale eyes studying her with that unsettling intensity she was beginning to recognize. "Can you? Your feet won't bear weight for another week, maybe longer. And even then you'll be clumsy as a newborn colt for a while." The clinical assessment in his voice reminded her uncomfortably of another doctor, another time, memories she pushed down with practiced force. Instead, she focused on the immediate present, the way Jeremiah's hands remained perfectly steady despite the isolation that would have driven most men to drink or madness. As her strength returned, she began to notice other things. The way he would sometimes pause in the middle of a task, head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. How his eyes would drift to the corners of the room where shadows gathered thickest, his expression becoming distant and troubled. Most unsettling of all were the moments when she would wake in the deep of night to find him sitting motionless by the dying fire, staring into the flames with a haunted look that spoke of guilt so heavy it had weight. "Tell me about your life before," she said one evening, as he cleaned and oiled his traps by lamplight. The routine had become familiar, him working in companionable silence while she mended clothes or sorted through his supply of medicinal herbs, his hands stilled on the steel jaws. Nothing worth telling. Man makes mistakes, pays for them. That's all there is to it. But Keturah had learned to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, the way his shoulders tensed when certain subjects arose. She'd survived 23 years of slavery by understanding the moods and motivations of dangerous men, and Jeremiah Stone carried danger in him like a loaded weapon with a hair trigger. "Were you married?" she pressed gently. "Children?" The trap snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones, and Jeremiah flinched as if the noise had startled him. For a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing something raw and agonized underneath. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No children. Never had the right to children." The pain in his admission was so acute that Keturah felt it like a physical blow. She recognized the particular quality of his anguish, the grief of someone who had lost not just what they had, but what they had never been worthy of having. It was a familiar weight, one that pressed against her own chest whenever she allowed herself to dream of the normal life that had been stolen from her in a Charleston basement. That night, as she lay listening to the wind howl around the cabin's eaves, Keturah found herself thinking about the strange contradiction that was Jeremiah Stone. He was capable of extraordinary gentleness. She'd seen it in the way he changed her bandages, in the patience with which he helped her regain her strength. Yet underneath that careful tenderness lurked something dark and self-loathing that occasionally surfaced in unguarded moments. She was beginning to understand that they were both refugees from their own past sins, though the nature of his remained a mystery. What kind of doctor abandoned his practice to become a hermit in the wilderness? What mistakes were so unforgivable that a man would exile himself to this beautiful, terrible isolation? The questions followed her into uneasy sleep, where she dreamed of children's voices calling through endless corridors of snow. In the dream, she searched for them desperately, following the sound of their cries through a maze of ice and shadow. But no matter how far she ran, how frantically she called out, they remained always just beyond reach, lost souls crying out for something she couldn't give them. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and the absolute certainty that her dreams were trying to tell her something important. Something about the man sleeping restlessly across the room, and the ghosts that seemed to follow them both. The morning after her disturbing dream, Keturah woke to find Jeremiah already gone. His absence felt different this time. Not the purposeful departure of a man checking his trap lines, but something more urgent. The fire had burned lower than usual, and frost covered the inside of the windows like delicate lacework, suggesting he'd left before dawn. She managed to hobble to the window on her bandaged feet, wincing with each step. Through the glass she could see his tracks in the fresh snow, leading not toward his usual hunting grounds but up the steep slope behind the cabin. The trail disappeared into a grove of ancient pines that seemed to swallow light itself. By midday, he still hadn't returned. Keturah found herself listening for the sound of his approach while she tended the fire and prepared a simple meal from his stores. The silence felt oppressive, charged with the same strange energy she'd noticed that first night. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she heard it again, that distant sound like children's voices, carried on wind that didn't touch the trees outside. This time she was certain it wasn't her imagination. When Jeremiah finally appeared in the doorway near sunset, he looked like a man who'd seen his own grave. His face was gray beneath his beard, and his hands shook as he hung up his rifle. Snow clung to his coat and hair, but what disturbed Keturah most was his eyes. They held the hollow look of someone forced to confront a truth he'd spent years avoiding. "Where did you go?" she asked, though something in his manner warned her she might not want to know the answer. He moved to the fire without speaking, holding his hands toward the flames as if he couldn't get warm. When he finally looked at her, there was a desperation in his gaze that made her stomach tighten. "There's something I need from you," he said, his voice rough with cold and something else. "Something I should have asked for straight away, but He trailed off, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm not a young man, Keturah. Winter up here breaks a person down, makes them think about what they're leaving behind when their time comes." The direction of his words sent ice through her veins. She'd known this moment would come. The payment demanded for her rescue, for the food and shelter and medical care. She'd hoped for more time to heal, to plan, but the haunted urgency in his manner suggested time was a luxury they no longer possessed. "I need children," he continued, the words tumbling out like a confession. "Heirs. Someone to carry on after I'm gone. You're young, healthy, In exchange for protection for a home here, I want you to bear me sons." Keturah felt the world tilt around her, the careful stability of the past weeks crumbling like ice beneath spring sun. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, fighting against the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. "I can't," she whispered. Jeremiah's expression shifted, hope curdling into something darker. "Can't? Or won't?" The question hung between them like an executioner's blade. Keturah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of shame and grief that had followed her from Charleston. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but knowing hadn't made it easier to speak the words that would seal her fate. "I can't bear children," she said, meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "The doctors at the plantation. They used us for experiments, cut things out of me that can't be put back." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Jeremiah stared at her with the intensity of a man trying to make sense of words spoken in a foreign language. She watched emotions flicker across his features, disbelief, then understanding, then a rage so pure and terrible it transformed his entire countenance. "Experiments," he repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "What kind of experiments?" Something in his tone made her step back, despite her injured feet. This was the danger she'd sensed beneath his careful gentleness, the darkness that had driven him to this isolated exile. For a moment, she glimpsed what Jeremiah Stone might have been capable of in his former life, and the knowledge terrified her. "They called it research," she said, her voice barely audible. "Said they needed to understand how our bodies worked, so they could prevent complications in the white women they delivered." The fire in the hearth flickered, as if responding to the fury radiating from Jeremiah's still form. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of judgment and damnation. What were their names? The question chilled her more than the mountain wind ever had. Because in that moment, Keturah realized that whatever had driven Jeremiah Stone to this wilderness sanctuary wasn't just guilt or shame, or the weight of his mistakes. It was hunger for something that felt uncomfortably like vengeance. And the children's voices in her dreams suddenly seemed less like memory and more like prophecy. The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Keturah felt her throat close around any response she might have given. The fury radiating from Jeremiah was palpable, transforming the familiar cabin into something alien and threatening. She pressed herself against the rough log wall, her bandaged feet screaming protest, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror clawing at her chest. "I don't remember," she whispered, which was both truth and lie. She remembered Dr. Marion Sims clearly, his thin face, his cold hands, the way he spoke about her body, as if she weren't present to hear it. But something primitive in her recognized that speaking his name aloud would unleash forces she couldn't control. Jeremiah's hands had curled into fists, and she could see the white of his knuckles through the weathered skin. The careful restraint he'd maintained for weeks was cracking like ice under pressure, revealing glimpses of something that made her stomach turn. This was what rage looked like when it had nowhere to go, when it had been feeding on itself for years in the dark. "Don't lie to me." His voice was soft, but there was something in it that made her think of winter storms gathering on distant peaks. "Their names. Keturah. I need their names." The desperation beneath his fury should have reassured her, but instead it deepened her fear. She'd seen men consumed by vengeance before, had watched masters destroy themselves chasing satisfaction that always remained just out of reach. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of an avalanche that had been building for decades. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. What difference does it make now? They're probably dead, or too old to... They're not dead. Jeremiah's interruption was sharp as a blade. Men like that, they don't die easy. They hide behind their titles and their fine houses and their goddamn righteousness until someone makes them pay. The venom in his voice made her shrink further against the wall. She could see him struggling with something, some internal battle between the careful control he'd maintained and something far more dangerous. His pale eyes had gone completely flat, like looking into winter sky just before a blizzard. "I can't tell you," she said finally. "I won't be part of whatever you're thinking." The admission seemed to deflate some of his rage, replacing it with something worse, a hollow desperation that reminded her uncomfortably of her dreams. He sank into his chair by the fire, suddenly looking every one of his years. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The things they did, the children they—" He stopped abruptly, as if the words themselves were poison. "Someone has to answer for it." Keturah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The children's voices from her dreams seemed to whisper at the edges of her consciousness, just beyond hearing but impossible to ignore. She thought of Jeremiah's careful medical supplies, his surgical instruments, the way he sometimes woke in the night with tears on his cheeks. "What children?" she asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Jeremiah's head snapped up, and for a moment she saw naked terror in his eyes. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." But she couldn't forget. The pieces were starting to form a pattern: his medical knowledge, his self-imposed exile, the guilt that followed him like a shadow. Most damning of all was the way he'd reacted to her revelation, as if her suffering had torn open wounds he'd spent years trying to heal. "You were one of them," she breathed. "The doctors who—" No. The denial came too quickly, too desperately. I would never hurt a child, never." But even as he spoke, she could see the lie eating at him from the inside. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but close enough to the bone to draw blood. Whatever Jeremiah Stone had done in his former life, it involved children. And if the voices in her dreams were any indication, those children were still with him. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. Keturah found herself caught between pity and terror, understanding that she was trapped in this cabin, not just with a man, but with his ghosts. The careful sanctuary he'd built in the wilderness was beginning to feel more like a tomb. "I should leave," she said, knowing even as she spoke that it was impossible. Her feet wouldn't carry her a mile through the snow, and winter had the mountain locked tight for months yet. "Where would you go?" Jeremiah's question held no mockery, only the weight of impossible mathematics. "You'd be dead before sunrise." The truth of it settled over her like a shroud. She was bound to this place, to this man, to whatever reckoning was building in the shadows around them. The children's voices grew stronger in the silence, and she knew with absolute certainty that her arrival had set something in motion, something that had been waiting years for the right moment to emerge. Outside, the wind began to howl. The howling wind seemed to carry voices within it, children's voices that made the cabin walls tremble. Keturah pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound came from inside as much as out, a chorus of the lost that her arrival had somehow awakened. Across the room, Jeremiah sat rigid in his chair, his face pale as bone in the firelight. "You hear them too," she whispered, and it wasn't a question. His only answer was the way his shoulders shook, as if he were fighting to hold something terrible inside. The careful distance he'd maintained between them collapsed in that moment of shared recognition. They were both haunted. She by what had been taken from her, he by what he had taken from others. The wind died suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. In that stillness, Keturah heard it clearly, the sound of small feet running across the roof, back and forth like children at play. Jeremiah's head snapped up, his eyes wild with something between terror and desperate hope. "They're stronger tonight," he said, his voice cracking. "Ever since you—" He trailed off, but she understood. Ever since her arrival, the barriers between the living and the dead had grown thin. A soft knock echoed from the cabin door. 3 gentle taps that could have been made by small knuckles. Both of them stared at the heavy wooden barrier that had always meant safety, now transformed into something that might not hold against what waited outside. "Don't answer it," Jeremiah whispered, but Keturah was already moving. Her feet screamed protest as she hobbled toward the door, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. The voices in her dreams had been calling her toward this moment, this choice between the known horror of staying trapped with a man haunted by his crimes and the unknown terror of whatever waited in the supernatural storm gathering around them. Keturah, no. Jeremiah lunged from his chair, but she was already lifting the heavy bar. The door swung open to reveal not the children she'd expected, but emptiness. Snow swirled in the doorway, and beyond it stretched a landscape that seemed subtly wrong. Too bright under the starless sky, shadows falling in directions that defied the moon's position. The cold that rushed in carried scents of things that shouldn't exist, summer flowers and medicinal ether, childhood laughter and screams of pain. "Mama?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, spoken by a child she couldn't see but somehow knew, a little girl with dark skin and eyes full of wisdom no child should possess. "Mama, we've been waiting." Tears streamed down Keturah's face as understanding crashed over her like an avalanche. These weren't random spirits. They were the children who had died under doctors' hands, the ones whose suffering had created the knowledge used to steal her own future. They recognized in her a kinship of pain, a mother's heart in a body that could never hold life. "I'm not your mama," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. In ways that transcended blood and birth, she was exactly what they needed, someone who understood their pain, who carried the same wounds carved by the same hands. Behind her, Jeremiah made a sound like a dying animal. "Please," he begged, "don't take them from me. They're all I have left." She turned to look at him and saw the truth written in his anguished face. He hadn't just worked alongside the doctors who had tortured these children. He had been their keeper, their nurse, the one who cleaned their wounds and held their hands as they died. His guilt wasn't for crimes committed, but for his failure to save them, for choosing his own survival over their protection. "You kept them here," she realized. "All these years, you've been trying to make amends." His voice broke completely. "But I failed them in life, and I've failed them in death. They deserve better than my guilt." The supernatural storm outside was intensifying, reality bending around the weight of accumulated grief and rage. Keturah understood that she stood at a crossroads. She could close the door, return to the terrible safety of captivity with a broken man, or she could step across the threshold into whatever lay beyond. The choice, when it came, felt like breathing after years of holding her breath. "I know," she said softly, speaking to the invisible children whose presence she felt like warmth against her skin. "I know it hurt. I know you were scared, but you don't have to be afraid anymore." She stepped forward into the impossible snow, her wounded feet finding purchase on ground that felt more like memory than earth. Behind her, Jeremiah cried out, but she didn't look back. The familiar world of the cabin, with its careful routines and terrible secrets, fell away as she crossed into the realm where the dead children waited. There was no going back now. Whatever came next would demand everything she had to give, but for the first time since Charleston, Keturah felt she was walking toward something that mattered more than survival. She was walking toward the children who needed her to be brave. The ground beneath her feet felt like walking on starlight, solid yet ethereal, real yet impossible. Each step carried her deeper into a realm where the laws of the living world held no dominion. The snow didn't melt against her skin, and the cold that should have killed her in minutes instead wrapped around her like a protective embrace. "Mama." The voice came from directly ahead now, and Keturah saw her, a small girl of perhaps 7 years, her dark skin luminous in the strange half-light. She wore a simple dress that might once have been white, but now seemed woven from moonbeams and sorrow. Other children began to materialize around her, emerging from the swirling snow like memories taking shape, boys and girls of various ages, all bearing the same ethereal glow, all watching Keturah with eyes that held centuries of pain. "We tried to tell you," said a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, "in your dreams." But the hurt man's guilt was too loud. Keturah's heart clenched at their presence. So beautiful, so heartbreaking. She knelt in the impossible snow, bringing herself to their level. I hear you now. I see you. The first girl stepped closer, her translucent hand reaching toward Keturah's face. You carry our pain. The cutting, the taking, the things they stole from inside. Yes, Keturah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks before dissolving into light. I carry it. But you lived, said another child, a boy with surgical scars that glowed like silver threads across his small chest. We couldn't live. They broke us too much. The weight of their shared suffering pressed against her. But instead of drowning her, it felt like recognition, like finally finding family after years of being alone. These children had endured the same violations, the same reduction of their bodies to experimental materials. But where she had survived, scarred and broken but breathing, they had passed beyond life's boundaries. The hurt man tried to help us, the first girl continued. But his hands shook too much. He was afraid of the cutting men, afraid of what they would do to him if he said no. Keturah glanced back toward the cabin, now barely visible through the supernatural snow. Jeremiah stood silhouetted in the doorway, not daring to follow but unable to look away. Even at this distance she could feel his anguish like a physical force. He wasn't one of them, she realized. He was the soft one, said a girl with braided hair who looked to be about 10. The one who sang to us when the pain was worst. The one who held our hands when we died. But he couldn't save us, the youngest boy added matter-of-factly. And now he hurts like we hurt, but he's still alive so he can't let go. The children began to move closer, forming a circle around Keturah. She felt their presence like warmth spreading through her damaged body, healing wounds that went deeper than flesh. But with that healing came understanding. Terrible, beautiful understanding of what they needed from her. You want me to help them cross over, she said. To find peace. We want you to help us be whole, the first girl corrected. We've been broken so long we forgot what it felt like to be children. But you remember childhood before the cutting. You remember what it felt like to be unafraid. As if summoned by her words, more children appeared, dozens of them, materializing from the swirling snow like stars emerging at dusk. Each bore the marks of medical horror, surgical scars, missing limbs, eyes that had seen too much suffering. Yet in this place between worlds they also radiated an innocence that death couldn't destroy. The rules here are different, explained an older boy who might have been 12. Pain can be healed. What was taken can be given back. But only by someone who understands both the breaking and the mending. Keturah felt power flowing through her. Not her own, but theirs, freely given. It was the energy of love that had been denied expression, of maternal instincts that had been perverted by those who saw only bodies to dissect. Here, in this impossible place, she could be what she'd been prevented from becoming. What about Jeremiah? She asked, though she already sensed the answer. He has to choose, said the girl with braided hair. Let go of the guilt that keeps us bound, or stay trapped with us forever. The supernatural storm was intensifying around them, reality bending further as more spirits gathered. Keturah understood that this moment was a test, not just of her courage, but of her capacity to heal wounds that extended far beyond her own suffering. She rose to her feet, the ghost children moving with her like a constellation of hope. Whatever came next would require her to embrace powers she didn't understand, to become something more than human, to help these lost souls find their way home. Behind her, Jeremiah's voice carried across the impossible distance. Keturah, please. I can't lose them too. She turned back toward him, her heart breaking for his pain even as she stepped deeper into her destiny. The distance between herself and Jeremiah felt like an ocean of grief, yet his voice reached her with crystalline clarity. She could see him silhouetted in the cabin doorway, one hand pressed against the frame as if the wood were all that kept him from collapsing. The children around her seemed to shimmer in response to his words, their forms becoming more solid, more present. He's been our anchor, whispered the boy with silver scars. His guilt keeps us tethered, but it also keeps us trapped. Keturah felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders. To help these children find peace, she would have to convince a man to release the only connection he had left to those he'd failed to save. Yet she could see in Jeremiah's anguished face that holding on to them was destroying him as surely as it was preventing their rest. "What happens if he won't let go?" she asked. The girl with braided hair took her hand, and Keturah gasped at the contact. Not cold as she'd expected, but warm with borrowed life. "Then we all stay here forever. Him, us, and now you. The storm will never end." As if to emphasize her words, the supernatural blizzard intensified around them. The boundary between the spirit realm and the living world was dissolving, reality warping under the pressure of accumulated pain. Keturah could feel the cabin itself beginning to shift, its solid wooden walls becoming translucent, permeable to forces that had been building for years. "Jeremiah," she called across the distance, "you have to come to us. I can't." His voice cracked with terror. "If I let them go, who will remember? Who will carry their names?" The children exchanged glances that held communications beyond words. The oldest boy, who looked perhaps 14 despite the surgical marks that mapped his throat, stepped forward. "Tell him," the boy said. "Tell him we don't need to be remembered. We need to be free." But Keturah could see that wasn't entirely true. These children did need something. Not the chains of guilt that bound them to Jeremiah, but the acknowledgement of their worth, their individuality, the lives they should have lived. They needed someone to witness their pain not as a burden to be carried, but as a story to be honored and released. She began to walk back toward the cabin, the children moving with her like a procession of starlight. Each step felt like preparation for battle, not against an enemy, but against the force that kept damaged souls locked in cycles of suffering. Behind her, she could feel more spirits gathering, drawn by the possibility of resolution that had eluded them for decades. "Jeremiah," she said as she drew closer, her voice carrying authority she didn't know she possessed. "Look at them. Really look." His gaze lifted from her face to the children surrounding her, and she watched his expression transform. Where before he had seen only his failures, now he was beginning to perceive their individual humanity. The girl who had loved flowers, the boy who had wanted to be a blacksmith, the twins who had died holding hands. They weren't just victims to be mourned. They were souls deserving of dignity. "I was supposed to protect them," he whispered. "When the doctors brought them to the ward, I was supposed to make it better. You were a prisoner too," Keturah said gently. "A different kind of slave, but enslaved nonetheless." The truth of her words seemed to physically stagger him. She could see him wrestling with the possibility of forgiveness, not just from the children but for himself. The guilt he'd carried like armor was beginning to crack, and with each fissure, the supernatural storm around them shifted. The cabin door began to glow with soft light, and Keturah realized that the building itself was transforming. What had been Jeremiah's fortress of isolation was becoming something else. A threshold, a crossing place where the living and the dead could meet on equal terms. "The challenge ahead," the girl with braided hair said softly, "isn't just about letting go. It's about choosing love over fear." Keturah felt the truth of those words resonate through her bones. The major test approaching wasn't supernatural in nature. It was deeply, painfully human. She would have to help a broken man find the courage to release his grip on the past, while these tortured children would have to trust that they could find peace beyond the familiar pain that had defined their existence. The storm was reaching its crescendo, reality bending so far that past and present began to blur together. She could see ghostly images overlaying the cabin, the medical ward where these children had suffered, the plantation where her own body had been violated, the endless cycle of cruelty that connected all their stories. But she could also see something else. Possibility. The chance that pain, acknowledged and witnessed and honored, could finally be transformed into something that served life rather than death. "Are you ready?" she asked, speaking to Jeremiah and the children equally. The answer came not in words, but in the way they all moved toward the transformed threshold, preparing to face whatever waited beyond. The threshold pulsed with otherworldly energy as they approached, and Keturah felt reality fracture around them like ice breaking under spring sun. The moment her foot crossed the cabin's entrance, the world exploded into chaos. She was no longer in one place, but everywhere at once. standing in the Colorado snow while simultaneously lying strapped to a medical table in Charleston, watching ghost children suffer while feeling the phantom weight of babies she would never carry. The supernatural storm had torn through the barriers between past and present, forcing her to experience every moment of violation and loss as if it were happening now. "Mama!" The children's voices came from all directions, but when she reached for them, her hands passed through empty air. They were fragmenting, pulled apart by the same forces that were splitting her consciousness across time and space. Through the chaos, she heard Jeremiah screaming, not in fear, but in agony as he was forced to relive every moment he'd failed to save a dying child. She could see him as he'd been then, younger, terrified, his hands shaking as he administered medicines he knew wouldn't help to children whose names he whispered like prayers. "This is what you wanted," he shouted at the swirling maelstrom. "To watch me break completely." But Keturah understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't punishment. It was purification. The storm was stripping away every lie, every protective barrier, every comfortable distance they'd placed between themselves and the truth of their shared trauma. To reach the other side, they would have to survive experiencing all of it at once. A child's hand slipped into hers, solid now, burning with desperate need. The little girl with braided hair was flickering between states, sometimes the ghostly spirit from the snow, sometimes a terrified patient on a surgical table, sometimes the child she might have been if she'd lived to grow up. "I'm scared, Mama," she whispered. And Keturah felt the words like knives in her chest because this child had called for her mother while dying, and no one had come. "I know, baby." Keturah managed through her own fragmentation. "I know you're scared." The ordeal was testing everything she'd learned, about survival, about love, about the difference between carrying pain and being destroyed by it. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to find some way back to the simple horror of the cabin, where at least the suffering was familiar and contained. But she could feel the children depending on her strength, their ghostly forms becoming more solid as she refused to let go. They needed her to be the mother who stayed, who didn't abandon them to face the darkness alone. Around them, the cabin was transforming into something impossible, part mountain shelter, part medical ward, part celestial crossing point. She could see through the walls to other times and places, the plantation where her body had been carved open, the hospital where these children had died, the countless other locations where the powerful had consumed the powerless. "It's all connected," she gasped, understanding flooding through her. Every violation, every stolen life, they're all part of the same wound. Jeremiah was on his knees now, surrounded by ghostly children who flickered between their spirit forms and their dying moments. She could see him struggling to hold them all, to carry every name and face and final breath, the weight of it crushing him into the floorboards. "Let them go," she commanded, her voice somehow carrying over the supernatural storm. "They don't need your guilt, they need your love. If I stop remembering, they'll disappear forever." "No," said the girl with braided hair, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "If you stop drowning us in your sorrow, we can finally become who we were meant to be." The ordeal was reaching its peak now, reality bending so far that Keturah could feel her own sanity threatening to snap. She was experiencing every trauma simultaneously while trying to hold space for dozens of suffering spirits, all while watching the only person who might help her fragments into madness. But in that moment of ultimate testing, she found something she hadn't known she possessed, the unshakable certainty of maternal love. Not love born from her womb, but love chosen, claimed, fierce as any biological bond. "You are all mine," she declared to the children, and the words rang with power that made the storm pause. "Not because I gave birth to you, but because I choose you. I choose to hold your pain until you're strong enough to let it go." The children began to glow brighter, their forms stabilizing as her love gave them the anchor they'd been seeking. And slowly, impossibly, Jeremiah began to understand what they were offering him, not the burden of eternal guilt, but the gift of forgiveness. The true ordeal wasn't the supernatural chaos around them. It was the choice to love without possession, to heal without controlling the outcome, to become something greater than the sum of their wounds. Everything hung in the balance as the storm reached its crescendo. The storm shattered, not into calm, but into something far worse. A crystalline moment of perfect clarity where Keturah could see exactly how her plan was failing. The children's forms, which had been stabilizing under her declaration of love, suddenly began to fracture again. But this time, it wasn't the chaotic dissolution of the supernatural storm. This was methodical, surgical, as if invisible hands were pulling them apart piece by piece. "Mama, we're slipping," the girl with braided hair cried out, her voice growing fainter even as she reached desperately toward Keturah. "Something's wrong." Keturah lunged forward, trying to gather the fragmenting children to her, but her hands passed through them like smoke. The maternal love that had anchored them moments before was being systematically severed, cut away by forces she didn't understand. She could feel her connection to each child being methodically destroyed, like surgical instruments slicing through spiritual tissue. She threw herself toward where the youngest boy was fading, his 5-year-old face becoming translucent. "I won't let you go." But even as the words left her mouth, she realized the horrible truth. Her love alone wasn't enough. She had believed, with all the fierce certainty of a woman who had survived unthinkable trauma, that choosing these children, claiming them as her own, would be sufficient to heal decades of accumulated suffering. She had been catastrophically wrong. Through the dissolving chaos, she heard Jeremiah's voice, but it carried a tone that made her blood freeze. Not the broken anguish of moments before, but something clinical, measured, terrifyingly familiar. "You cannot save them," he said, and when she turned toward him, the man she had begun to trust was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, the doctor he had been, the one who had held scalpels instead of axes, who had spoken in the calm, dispassionate voice of medical authority. They belonged to science. They always have. The cabin around them was transforming again, but not into the celestial crossing point she had glimpsed. The rough wooden walls were becoming sterile white plaster. The fireplace dissolved into gleaming medical equipment. The scent of wood smoke gave way to the sharp bite of carbolic acid and ether. "Jeremiah, fight this!" Keturah screamed, but she could see in his eyes that whatever had broken free during the storm wasn't the guilt-ridden mountain man she knew. It was something older, more deeply buried, the part of him that had learned to survive by becoming what his captors demanded. The children were crying now, their ghostly forms being pulled inexorably toward examination tables that materialized from the walls. She watched in horror as the boy with silver scars was lifted by invisible hands, his small body strapped to cold metal despite his struggles. "We thought you would save us," he whispered, his voice already growing distant. "We thought if we found a mother who understood." "I do understand." Keturah threw herself against the restraints that were appearing on her own body, phantom straps that felt all too real as they pinned her to a table that hadn't existed seconds before. "I choose you! I claim you!" "Choice is an illusion," Jeremiah said, his voice now carrying the precise diction of medical training. "Bodies are specimens. Pain is data. Love is merely chemistry that can be adjusted with the proper intervention." She could feel him approaching with instruments she couldn't see but could sense. Sharp things that promised to cut away not just flesh but the very capacity for connection that had made her declaration of motherhood possible. The surgical violation of her reproductive organs had been only the beginning. Now they would take her ability to love, to choose family, to believe that any bond could survive the clinical reduction of human beings to their component parts. "The children will return to their proper state," he continued with terrifying calm. "Specimens to be studied. Their pain will be useful. Your pain will be useful. All of it will serve the greater understanding." The girl with braided hair was fading faster now, her desperate reaching becoming weaker as she was pulled back toward whatever realm held souls trapped between life and death. "Mama," she whispered, but the word was barely a breath. "Mama, don't forget us." Keturah felt something breaking inside her chest, not her heart, which had been broken before and healed, but something deeper. The part of her that had dared to believe that love could triumph over systematic cruelty. The part that had imagined she could become a mother to the motherless, a healer to the irreparably wounded. She was losing them, all of them. The children she had claimed, the man she had begun to trust, and most devastatingly, the version of herself that had believed transcendence was possible. The storm hadn't been a test of her strength. It had been a trap, designed to strip away every defense before delivering her back to the place where she was nothing but a body to be manipulated by those who wielded scalpels and spoke of science. The last thing she saw before the ether claimed her consciousness was the girl with braided hair disappearing completely, her final expression not one of peace, but of profound betrayal. Everything was lost.